podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rosie Nice, executive coach, leadership development consultant, and founder of Magic Coaching. And in this new series, we'll be exploring how organisations can thrive and help their teams reach their full potential by creating a successful coaching culture. I'll be talking with leaders from a wide range of organisations, inviting them to share their personal, real-life experiences of embedding a coaching approach within their workplace, hearing their successes, the challenges they've faced, and the lessons they've learned along the way. Our aim is to offer practical insights and inspire you with the confidence to cultivate an environment where coaching becomes integral to organisational success, a culture of healthy, high performance. Hello and welcome to this episode in our series focusing on building a successful coaching culture. Today's guest is Charlotte Hurst, who until recently was Managing Director of Farsight Consulting. So hello Charlotte and welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, you're very welcome. It's lovely to have you. So please can we ask you to introduce yourself to the listeners before we get started and tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Farsight?
Yeah, so I suppose starting from the beginning, my first job after university was in what was then the Civil Service European Fast Stream, where I worked on policy things like European standards on the flammability of circus tents. So I'd done languages at university, so it was great to use my French a bit, but I quickly worked out that I was more interested in how you implement policy and how you run and improve services at scale than in just developing the policy itself. So I got involved quite early on in all sorts of major change projects. So things like defining how the job seekers allowance would work in practice and planning how to roll it out across the country. I think looking back, what's always really interested me is the combination of goals and people and places and technology and processes and how you bring all those things together. So early on, I got trained up in Prince project management methodologies and in managing successful programs and so on. And I spent a lot of my career working on different projects and changes in different bits of the public sector, in Royal Mail, in charities. I worked as an in-house project manager and a business change manager for a big consultancy company, one of the larger ones. And then I went freelance and started working as a contractor. So I was working as a contractor when I joined Farsight Consulting back in 2012. At that point, there were only about 6 people. There was the founder, Pete Masters, and a handful of contractors, including me. So it's a kind of a classic model for starting and building up a consultancy or a professional services business. And Pete had recruited me at that point just as one of his contractors, but we really clicked. And after about a month, he asked me to come and join him as his first proper employee and to build the business up with him. And the two of us, I think, had backgrounds which were similar but different in quite a complementary way. So we'd both been around for quite a while as project and program managers in the public sector and in private, not-for-profit organisations too, working both of us on projects that used the introduction of technology as a way to change and improve things. But my background was much more around people, business change, culture, behaviours, organisational shape and structure, whereas Pete was much more focused on the actual technology side of things. So, knowing what technology was out there, designing it to create an end-to-end solution, and also the commercial side, how you could get different organisations to work together commercially and financially. And probably my strengths were more around developing the teams and organisations and putting ideas into practice. So that, I think, is why I was really interested in being given that job of starting to build up the company, which started with recruiting employee number 2, and then over time became being the managing director of what became a larger and larger company over the following sort of 10 years or so.
Brilliant. Okay, so tell us what Farsight actually did as an organisation to give us some context.
Yeah, so we've described it as digital and business transformation. What that actually means in practice is that we worked for clients and brought people and teams in to work for those clients. The clients were usually government departments or agencies or bits of those departments and agencies, also some private sector, financial services and so on, and not-for-profit organisations like charities. And those clients would usually bring us in to help them solve problems and improve or update things. So it pretty much always involved using technology and digital services, online services, better or in new ways, but never just about technology, because there's always, of course, a big element about people both in terms of the users of those services and the people inside the organisation who need to deliver and manage the services. And the services themselves always include an element of what we sometimes describe it as analogue provision. So, you wouldn't do everything online, for example, when you're delivering those services. And the things we worked on, just to give a few examples, like helping with the process of assessing and appointing new judges. So doing it in a way that was used technology and data better to make it more efficient, more transparent, and more effective. Looking at ways to improve the matching of hard-to-place children in care to potential adoptive parents. Working on a solution to find ways for schools to fill their teaching vacancies at a lower cost. So typically the projects which were around delivering policy goals faster, better, more efficiently using technology, but also working with people and organisations. And I think one of the important things to say, particularly when we're going to get onto the role of coaching, is that typically our clients wouldn't know how to solve those problems at the start. It wasn't a question of them just telling us what to do. So they usually wouldn't know necessarily what was out there, what their options might be. There was always an element of going on a journey together to explore things and find things out. And our role, the role of our team, our people, was often to help guide and drive and enable that process by finding out what was feasible and allowable and what might have the right kind of impact, particularly when clients might be feeling a bit stuck or knew that they didn't really understand what the underlying issues were or how they might go about making change happen. So back in when I sort of started, 2012, 2013, a lot of what we were doing was helping to establish the new agile and digital ways of working, using the government digital services approach, which at that point was fairly new and a bit experimental. It's become much more sort of mainstream now. And that involves taking things through different stages. So you'd start with discovery, where you focus on building up and sharing an understanding of the issue of the users and the problems. Then alpha, where you start to test out different hypotheses and options, running little tests and so on, in order to isolate different sort of components and different things that you could do. Fail fast, come up with workable propositions. And then cycles of private and public beta, where you'd actually build services, test them with users and data, go through cycles of refining, tweaking and improving them, rolling them out to larger and larger audiences. So one of the things I really liked about the work that we did was that it wasn't the kind of consultancy where you would write a report or do a presentation on what you think the client should do and then leave. It was very much on going on a practical journey together, designing, building, testing things, sharing knowledge, everyone sort of going on that journey together, and then actually creating new services which made a real difference.
Fascinating. So that gives us a great context, if you like, about Farsight and the company and the services that you provided. And I had the privilege of providing consultancy services to you at Farsight around learning and development and coaching for the last 5 or 6 years before the business was sold. And I was always so extraordinarily impressed by the strength of the culture that you had created. So I'm so delighted to have this opportunity for you to share your experience with us, and particularly how you built and maintained a successful culture of coaching and learning all the way through the various stages of the company's evolution. So that's what we're going to take a bit more of a dive into now. So we're here to talk about how you built a successful coaching culture. You've mentioned coaching already. So let's start by asking, why did you decide to focus on a coaching culture within Farsight?
We didn't really start by deciding explicitly that we wanted to build a coaching culture. We started by wanting to build a successful business, and a business which was really focused around people. I mean, crudely, what you do in that sort of business is you sell people and their services to clients. So it's a very people-focused business. And we ended up, as we built the business and scaled things up, by creating a lot of our business model and process around coaching. Not necessarily because we sort of had a light bulb moment right at the beginning, but because we realised more and more over time that using coaching almost as the micro process would enable us to provide high-performing people who could work with clients at scale and in a cost-effective way. And I think that's actually a really important part of our story, looking back, is that we used coaching and the wider coaching-based culture around it to create a successful business and scale it up. And our approach went through lots of different stages along the way, but there were some sort of key principles that flowed all the way through. And there was definitely a thing about building in a really strong emphasis on coaching and learning and improving and exploring and being open and flexible. So those were sort of some really key principles that underpinned it.
Yeah. So you didn't start by deliberately choosing a coaching culture. It was more about building a business, and coaching was an enabler of that business success. Tell us more about that.
Going right back to the point where I joined the business and sort of hooked up with Pete and became employee number one of what eventually became about 140 employees, I think, by the time that we sold the company. So Pete and I both loved what we were doing. We felt we were adding value with clients, being able to work with interesting people on things that really mattered, and we could see the commercial opportunities to do more of that. We knew what we were doing and what we wanted to do, but there were only the two of us, and we wanted to do more, and there were opportunities to do more. So we wanted to build the business that in a way that wasn't just about the two of us. It needed to be bigger, bringing in other people, and not just experienced, expensive contractors. So by contractors, I mean people who work freelance through their own limited companies, who typically want to move around a lot. But we wanted to also start building up a cohort of permanent employees who would come on the journey with us, and being really blunt, who were also a bit cheaper. So, and we thought we could do that, but we needed to think about why. Because we realised it was going to be difficult to recruit people as permanent employees who were already experienced in the kind of work we were doing and in doing it using these agile techniques. Partly because the work itself was changing and evolving quite quickly. So there just wasn't a big established pool of people out there. This was sort of 12 years ago. And the experienced people who were out there tended to be quite expensive. So we decided to try and recruit people who didn't have that experience, but who we thought had the potential and the core capabilities to do well in that space and enjoy it. That meant our focus needed to be on finding those people and then building them up. So one of the first things that I focused on was finding people, recruiting people. And we worked out our spec. So we decided to look for people with natural intelligence, curiosity, common sense, who were good logical thinkers. So we really needed people who would be quite careful about drawing evidence-based conclusions from data, but who could also be a bit creative, think laterally, come up with new ideas for working around problems. And we also wanted people who were nice, who were nice, decent individuals who we and our clients would want to work with, because trust was a really important part of the whole model. So no massive egos, people who were reliable, honest, with good communication skills, so good listeners and good at drawing other people out, as well as being good explainers. And crucially, we needed them to be good at taking new things on board, at pivoting, as we called it, when something came up that meant they would need to change direction. So that was the spec. And that's, in some ways, it's quite a demanding spec. And we didn't find but people who automatically ticked all of the boxes. We were looking for the best fit that we could get to. And we knew that everyone would need to work on certain areas. Typically at the start, we were recruiting fairly recent graduates, some of them with master's degrees, some of them just with undergrad degrees, maybe a couple of years of work experience. So some people had a year in industry. Quite a few actually had worked in charities, which I think on reflection is quite an interesting environment where you often need to be quite creative and resilient and persistent to get things done without a lot of additional support and resource. We had quite a few STEM graduates and also quite a lot of people with degrees in things like history or languages, things that help you to understand systems, analyse and spot patterns and explain things. So we found some really great people, but obviously they didn't start with being super experienced in the ways of working that we needed to apply with our clients. So we then started to think about, found the people, how do we support them? How do we help them grow? How do we make them into a team?
Okay. And I know that some of those early employees stayed with you right the way through the journey, through the huge changes that the company underwent, and we'll come to some of that. So tell us, you were recruiting people with a lot of potential early on in their careers typically. So what sort of support and processes did you focus on in those early years?
So my priorities, I worked out quite early on, were first of all, finding the people, but then helping them learn, keeping an eye on what they were actually doing with clients, because usually I wouldn't be there in the room with them, and providing a great place to work so that people would do well and also so they wouldn't leave. So in order to do that, I'd pick out three things that we did which were really fundamental to that. So thing one was making sure that the recruitment process reflected our ways of working. So in interviews, we would give people practice exercises to do, which mimicked as best we could the kind of work that we did in real life and also the kind of ways that we'd do it. So we'd get people to analyse a couple of mocked up situations and play back their findings and their recommendations. And we'd get them to do that and give them feedback in the interviews in the way that we do it with the team in practice. So that was useful, both to give them a flavour of what they'd be doing in practice and see if they liked it or not, but also for us to see how they would react and to show them the kind of behaviours that we valued, and both from them and that we would try and and follow ourselves in terms of things like giving honest, constructive feedback. So we had a couple of things in the exercises where many people would make a faulty assumption, not because they were daft or had done anything wrong, but just because it was really easy to fall into those traps. And that would mean that their findings weren't correct and would need to be reworked. So we wanted to see how people would respond to that kind of situation. We were looking for people who were confident enough not to be thrown completely or to burst into tears, but also who'd be kind of humble and flexible enough to be able to pivot and to realise that it wasn't their fault that they'd missed something and that was okay. And also that kind of demonstrated our behaviours and our ways of working as a company in terms of giving and receiving feedback, listening, being evidence-based, being flexible. So thing two then was one-to-one support and coaching. So we didn't really call it coaching to begin with, because certainly I didn't really know that was exactly what we were doing, or some of the models and theories around how to do it well. But right from the start, we focused on making time, and initially it was mainly me, to meet up with each individual one-to-one on a really regular basis to stop and reflect and listen to what they were doing, to help them work out how to handle things and to help them grow in both competence and confidence. Because one of the key drivers for doing that is that we really needed people to be self-managing and also to be quite honest in terms of picking up anything that wasn't going quite as well as it could do. Because, first of all, I wasn't there with them on a day-to-day basis. They'd often be the only person on a Farsight project team. And also their role on the project team was often to pull things together to help determine and articulate the best way forward. in settings that could often be quite fast moving, quite challenging, quite uncertain, where there wasn't necessarily a well-trodden path to follow. So they were playing quite a really interesting but quite challenging role. And finally, our reputation and success as a company depended on them managing that process well. So that's why that one-to-one coaching, support, reflection process became so important from early on. And then quite quickly, and with your support, Rosie, we started to articulate that as coaching. So we gave everyone an introduction to coaching from an early stage. And looking back, the first formalised training modules that we rolled out across the company were, I think, introduction to coaching, giving and receiving feedback, handling conflict, understanding different communication styles, understanding different learning styles, and emotional intelligence. So that one-to-one coaching process was really at the heart of the company and of building the company from early on. It's almost like the micro process that drove and fed a lot of other things. And then finally, in terms of sort of describing how we approach things, I think thing 3 that I'd pick out, so the recruitment process was the first one. The second one is one-to-one support and coaching. And the third thing is about the team. So on a more macro level, as well as building up the individuals through one-to-one coaching, we had a thing from the start that we called Farsight Fridays. So that was about getting people together once a week. And initially we did it physically, and we were small enough that everyone could stand in one circle to catch up, share ideas and learn together. So really looking back, it was sort of institutionalized coaching and learning that we were trying to roll out. So building up the collective Farsight brain, or hive mind, we sometimes described it as. So we'd get people to develop and share methodologies and tools, things like spreadsheets and surveys and bits of code, because we wanted people to feel empowered and be good at working things out on their own, but also to be able to come back kind of to the mothership and ask for help when they needed it. And learning from other people obviously sort of speeds up the learning process, but I think it also gives people different and broader perspectives and points out the things that you might not necessarily think about. So it fills in gaps in knowledge, and it also, I think, helps people make judgment calls about the limits of their own ability. So having both the one-to-one process and the wider team process was really valuable and helpful for us. And I think that really paid dividends over the long term and started to deliver a lot of benefits and helped us to scale the company up through those different stages.
So you talked about at this stage, you could get everybody in one room, standing in one circle. And as the company grew, you used coaching almost without knowing it was coaching, if you like, as you first started bringing it. And then you started to more consciously adopt coaching principles. So tell us a little bit more about how you maintained the culture. Did you have key principles that you hung on to as the company grew?
Yes, I'd say we had probably about 4 key principles that stayed the same, even though on a practical level they might have been implemented in a slightly different way as we went through our different phases of growth. And I think the first one is everyone should have a coach. So to begin with, I was the coach, but then over time, we got to the stage where that wasn't enough. I couldn't do everybody. So we had other people who I would coaching others in the company. And for us, really important point, your coach is not your line manager in terms of kind of telling you what to do or managing you on a day-to-day basis. A good line manager will do a lot of the same things that our coaches did. So our model of everyone having a coach really involved people understanding that you're empowered, you're responsible for your own performance, your own behaviour, and your own learning. But your coach is there to help you reflect and learn, give you a space to stop and think and talk, and navigate, helping you to work out how to navigate your own way around your projects and also around the support that we offered through the company. So we provided a lot of support in terms of coaching and learning opportunities, but we expected people to make use of those. So the coach helping people to understand their role and grow into it, I think was really important. So that's the first thing, everyone has a coach. Second thing, you put time into it. So you must have regular coaching sessions between the coach and coachee. So generally, we encourage people to meet up at least once a month for an hour. Sometimes it might be more often for people who were new or going through a difficult or demanding stage. And then once a quarter, our coaching sessions would broaden out to include more focus on gathering feedback, reflecting on results, reviewing performance, which then linked into the promotion and salary review process. Because obviously we were not just using coaching as a process outside of the workplace. We were, if you like, kind of institutionalizing coaching. So one of the things that we really had to think about as we went through is how that coaching process linked into the wider organisation and things like performance management, because I do think it's important that the two don't become entirely detached. So that regular cycle of coaching sessions, for me, there's a few things in there. It's got to happen. It's got to happen regularly. People have to put time into it. So it's not just lip service. It has to be done well. And it has, in some form or another, to sort of feed into the wider processes in the organisation. The third principle I think I'd pull out, which ran through everything that we did, over the course of all of those 12 years, even though it took different forms, is what I would describe as kind of institutionalized learning. So an intentional and explicit focus on learning and skills development. We put a lot of time and thought into that, and we developed what we described as a skills academy with a number of different modules. I think we got up to about 90 different modules, and each of those modules had a practical session, face-to-face session that could be delivered. There were materials that people could access with methodologies and models and so on, supporting different learning styles. So some people like to learn in a very practical way. Others like to sit down in a quiet room on their own and look at the theoretical side of things and get their head around it. But we had about 80, 90 different modules in our Skills Academy covering all sorts of technical things like how to write a business case, some quite things around data analysis, doing user research and so on. But we also treated coaching itself as a skill within the Skills Academy. And there's a few reasons for that. One is I think coaching is a skill like any other skill, and you learn it and you hone it over time. You become better at it. You can talk about it. Different people do it slightly differently. But also we didn't want a sense that you had coaching and then you had the job. It's all, coaching was so closely integrated with all the other soft skills that were essential for the way people did their jobs. And then the final principle, I think, was this point about integration and everything needing to be joined up and consistent across the different processes and structures in the organisation. So what we tried to do was to integrate coaching, giving and receiving feedback, and lifelong learning into the way that we ran the company. It was really important, I think, for us to be consistent in the messaging that we gave out and what we actually did in practice. So demonstrating that everybody needs to learn, everybody shares, everybody listens. Recruitment and performance management and promotions and internal communication all start right from the very beginning. That's why we did it in the interviews and went all the way up to the most senior people. And I think demonstrating those behaviours from the start, thinking about how to build in the details across the different processes and constantly paying attention to how it works in practice, not just how you think it's working, but what people are actually doing, particularly as you scale, is really important so that you get that consistency in practice as well as in theory.
Yeah. So you developed these 4 principles that you've described over time and clarified them and refined them. And how did you maintain those when the company grew? You talked about the evolution of the company going through different stages. As it grew, how did you maintain those key principles?
So I think with hindsight, we probably went through 3 main stages, and stopping and describing them to ourselves as different stages and trying to realise when something needed to change, I think was really important. So I'd say that the first stage is what I have in my head as kind of circle time, where we could literally get everyone physically in one room in a circle. We did sort of everything together. It was still very much Pete and me overseeing things. And we got the team to develop and share their methodologies for things, but we didn't always write it down, because we could get everybody together. And there was a lot of focus on me having one-to-ones with the team and reflecting on how things were going and helping them think things through. Then we got to a stage where we probably got above 20 people, and we realised that we couldn't get everyone in the room together very comfortably. And also when it came to the sharing and learning stuff, some people had done some of the sessions already. Then we had new people that hadn't done them. So we needed to kind of redo the sessions. And I would describe that session as that stage as kind of formalising a skills academy. So to me, that was about a couple of things. One was sort of writing things down, delivering them again, so that, you had 10 people that already done the session and then 10 people that needed to do it. So that, a greater level of sort of organisation and planning and structure. And then in terms of the coaching, at that stage, we started getting beyond the point where I could coach everybody. So we started, as part of that formalised skills academy, training more coaches and then overseeing those coaches. And we also introduced action learning sets, which I think with hindsight were really, really fundamental, because actually I wasn't in those action learning sets. And that was a big thing for me about kind of letting go. So we would have, action learning sets of about 6 to 8 people who would contract with each other to meet up once a month to support each other with learning and practice in whatever areas they wanted to focus on. We had a facilitator in the room for the first few sessions, but then the idea was that after that, the groups would become self-supporting. And that worked, I think, really well, not necessarily for everybody, but there were a bunch of people who absolutely loved that. And it became a key part of them then taking over the responsibility for coaching and looking after other people and spreading the culture and defining the way that they wanted things to work. And then the third stage I described as kind of broadening the shoulders, which was probably when we got beyond about 60 people. And I don't know if that's common in other organisations as well, but at that point we got to a stage where really we needed a much more sophisticated internal structure. You needed to have sort of heads of different things. And we formalised things at that point into having a more structured support structure around our coaches. So we had a specific coaching pathway, we had coaching clinics. So that's all from the coaching angle, I think, about making sure that you are doing things to build in consistency and high standards and excellence in a coaching environment where you've got multiple coaches coaching lots of different people. And again, you're not in the room with them. So, you don't really know what they're doing. But what you need to do is to set up that kind of backdrop of support. And we applied the same sort of principles, that those coaches had a coach to talk about. We had an institutionalized approach to coaching and learning. We were, quite focused on articulating what good looked like. And we applied those principles to scaling up our coaching model as well. And we did that for other things as well. We had, as well as a coaching pathway, we had learning pathways for service design, user research, performance analysis, and so on. So the whole company was scaling and growing with a focus on making things sustainable at scale. So, and more focus, I suppose, on quality control and fairness and so on, and performance management alongside coaching and account management alongside coaching, because we had, by definition, a larger number of people who were taking on a responsibility for an accountability for making things a success. So, looking back, there was quite a lot of change. And I think your question, Rosie, was really about how did we maintain consistency? And I think one of the things that really helped was facing up to the fact that it had to be done and being prepared to unpick what you'd done and rebuild it. Thinking about the values and principles and ideas and so on that needed to stay at the heart of it. Because whilst things changed dramatically when we went from 2 employees to 150, some of the key principles remained the same about, wanting to make it a nice place to work, doing great work for clients, supporting people, looking for the right kind of people with the potential who were a good match to the work, but then supporting them through coaching and a wider focus on learning. So I think that would be my answer, I think, is by explicitly focusing on culture and behaviour and feel as part of scaling the organisation, as well as finding bigger offices and managing the budget and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I saw how you did manage to hang on to and then build and keep those principles at the core of the culture. And you talked about big change coming through growth. You were on a fantastic growth stream coming into 2019, 2020. You had quite a face-to-face model of working. And then we all know what happened early 2020. We suddenly went into lockdown and the ways of working changed dramatically for everybody. How did you manage working during lockdown and then the following hybrid working model, which came out of that? How did you manage that process, that experience?
Yeah, it was a very strange time. A massive and quite unexpected change. And our model up to that point had been quite sort of physical and on-site. So a lot of our people were typically, spending 3-4 days a week on client side, some of them travelling, we were London-based, but, travelling outside of London. And suddenly that had to change. I remember having to make all the phone calls to our clients saying, people aren't going to be in tomorrow. It was really weird. But basically, we had to reinvent the way we did things and reimagine things pretty much overnight. So there was some really practical stuff about, trying to get hold of monitors and desks and chairs and ship them out to people and, saying to people, no, you can't work sitting on the end of your bed. You can't work on your coffee table sitting on a poof. No, you need proper stuff. So there was a practical stuff around all of that. But also going back to that point about being explicit about the culture and feel, we just had to think through, quickly, how do you keep that culture? How would we do Farsight Fridays when nobody can go into the building? So we reimagined it all, and we found actually there was a lot, again, using technology, and that was the kind of stuff that we did as a company. So we thought about how you can use, what technology is there, how can you use it, how can you create team sessions, the intimacy of a one-to-one session online. And I think on the whole, it worked really well, and it actually helped with some of the growth process that I was talking about. So some of the things that we were trying to do about delivering and redelivering sessions on things like being innovative or handling conflict or writing a business case or whatever. Some of those things actually worked really well online, but you needed to think quite hard about what principles were that you wanted people to understand and practice. How do you design exercises to do that? And similarly with coaching, I think quite quickly we just shifted things to work online. And I think what helped probably was having clarity around why we were doing coaching from the start, what it's for. And then once you understand why you're doing it, what it's for, what you want people to get out of it, it's then probably easier to shift it to a different platform. And we carried on actually after lockdown with a lot of our coaching happening one-to-one, and it worked quite well. But yeah, at the time it was a bit of a shock. But I think we kind of incorporated it into our design and used it as a way to actually help us become more flexible.
Yes, absolutely. And when you look back, you've talked about reflecting, looking back on the whole journey that you went on. What were some of the hardest bits to get right? What were the most challenging bits for you?
I think one thing that was hard all the way through is situations where people are underperforming and don't immediately recognise it or find it very difficult to face up to that. So I think our coaching process actually became stronger when, as we over time supplemented it and supported it with a strong, effective, fair performance management process. Because I think when you're using coaching in an organisational context, you have to have a good performance management approach running alongside that for it to be fair and anchored in reality, and to bring in, it's almost like looking in the mirror, or it's a different aspect of looking in the mirror, so that people really understand and reflect on how they're doing in absolute terms as well as how they're doing in relative terms. But those are hard conversations sometimes. And that's one of the things that we focused on a lot in developing our coaches and developing our people, is having tricky conversations. But often those are really valuable conversations in the longer term. when there's a mismatch between people's self-assessment and other people's assessment, that's one thing that we always found, that it just is difficult, but it's important. Second thing I think that I found tricky was when we had people joining, particularly at more senior levels from other organisations. Some of them loved the model and got it immediately, but we certainly had some people who didn't get the coaching model. I remember having one conversation with someone where she said, "So what does this mean, you being my coach?" And I was trying to explain, this is me helping you to reflect and be your best self. And she was like, "Why?" It's quite difficult, I think, sometimes to make that transition where people haven't been used to that. But interestingly, that individual is now a coach somewhere else. So I think even though I found that quite hard, and it really made me question the value and the approach, particularly with more senior people, again, I think that was well worth sticking with. And then the third thing I think that was a knotty but important issue is consistency. So when you've got, I can't remember how many coaches we had at the point where I moved on, but we probably had about, I don't know, 40 people trained and active as coaches, something like that. And, it's back to that point of, you're not in the room with them. You don't know what they're doing. So how to influence what people do and how to make sure that it's good. And people do things in really different ways. And for me, that was one of the great points, was seeing other people coaching who were probably much better at it than I ever was, and who might do it in really different ways. And then matching, coaches to people who they really clicked with, because the chemistry doesn't always click. So I think these are all points actually where scaling things up and using coaching as part of the wider organization design isn't always easy, but it's well worth persisting with. I think that was certainly one of the things I took away, that you need to work through some of those things which are perhaps a little bit knotty, a bit challenging, but they're well worth doing.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're talking about one-to-one coaching happening around the organisation. You're talking about group coaching through the process of action learning. And there's a distinction, I think, isn't there, between setting up coaching as a process between two people or within a group, but also that wider culture where the principles of coaching are right at the heart of it. What are your thoughts around that wider culture of coaching?
I think you're right that in my head, it's almost like the micro and the macro. So you can't have that wider culture of coaching without it happening on an individual one-to-one level, but also the individual one-to-one process where you have two people in a room or on a call you can leverage it, and it becomes so much more powerful, where you have hundreds of those conversations happening across the organisation, and they're supported by the wider culture and cross-organisational processes and so on. So I think doing both enabled us to scale and grow the business in a way that really worked. And it was partly because of the nature of the work that we did, where it's all about people. It's all about empowering people and helping them work out what to do when you rock up to work on a Monday morning and it just isn't always clear what you should be doing. So you need people to be quite resilient, quite imaginative, but also well schooled in their particular discipline. So they need to have quite a lot of strings to their bow, and they need to know which to bring in when. So for us, coaching both at the macro and the micro level was a really effective way of building up people and building up a team. In fact, going back to what we talked about at the beginning about, when I started my career, I was always quite focused on organizations and structure and design and so on, not just on technology, and also not just on individual people. So I think giving thought to the design of the organization, the design of the processes, the consistency of how things hang together is really important too. We all know how important culture and feel is, but you can't just create or shape a culture by using words to describe it. I think you really need to look at what happens in practice, what people's experience is. And as you scale, and you go to 150 people or whatever it is, it's their lived experience that matters, not yours. It's getting those details right, constantly tweaking and changing and adapting. And you go, oh, whoa, I thought that was working really well. Clearly, it's not working fantastically in that space. It's okay. Let's just work it through and, think about how we might change it. So it's a constant ongoing process, I think. There were lots of those different sort of stages that we went through, but I think sticking to those principles and also bringing in, again, that kind of point of always trying to be constantly learning ourselves, being humble, acknowledging that you're not going to get it right. And also it's not just about you sitting in an ivory tower describing as the leader of an organization what you want it to be like. It's how it is in practice. And I think the coaching, because I was always learning a lot through the coaching process, meeting up with people on a one-to-one level. And, up to the day when I left, I was coaching, 15 or 16 people, I think, at different levels in the organization and interacting with people. So I think you need to keep it live and living, as well as doing the more design-focused things around kind of defining what good looks like, getting people to input to that, and having data about how well it's working. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I suppose what I'm trying to describe is a process for creating and shaping a culture, and the ways in which we used coaching, both on a macro level as that process of two people meeting up once a month or however often it is, and then the macro that's around that supports multiple coaches in being really great at coaching, and that helps people fit coaching within a wider set of skills. One of the things that gave me huge pleasure was seeing how our people were using the language that we'd established in our Skills Academy sessions and in our coaching sessions with each other, and also using it with their clients. So I don't mean to kind of, trying to go in and say, I'm going to, coach you, client, because you're not very good at X, Y, Z, not in a patronizing way, but in a way of establishing that calm and constructive process of reflecting on what's going on, spotting problems, talking about them, working them through. Two minds are always better than one, and helping people grow individually and as a team, and then helping our clients grow individually and as teams. That gave me huge satisfaction. And looking back, I hope that's a bit of a lasting legacy in some form or another.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that one of the indicators, if you like, around a true coaching culture is when coaching is not just happening in coaching sessions. Coaching becomes the way that you communicate with each other. And you talked about people using the language of the skills academies and using the skills and behaviours of coaching in interactions with clients and with each other outside of what you would describe as a coaching session.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's where also doing the coaching alongside the Structured Skills Academy, it was very valuable, because in a funny sort of way, it helps shorthand certain conversations. So, I would hear people saying, oh, yeah, that's the emotional intelligence model. If you think about that, that's why that isn't happening so easily. Or, people would say, can you help me with this? I've tried the GROW model, but have you got any other ideas? And, some of that just sort of made me laugh. It was lovely to hear people doing that. But also it does help it's another element, I think, of establishing sort of a tangible culture, and you hear the language, you pick up on the style that people use, and it becomes quite distinctive. So all of those different elements we talked about I think you get even more value where you do them together, so the coaching on the individual level, the wider stuff, the focus on institutionalized learning, which, for us, we described as our Skills Academy, but there's lots of different ways to do it. And actually, I think the question you asked, Rosie, about lockdown is quite illuminating, because using technology to support a lot of what we were doing actually was quite a trigger point for scale. And shifting it away from the very physical model, and we all come in on Friday and we're physically in one room together. That becomes harder and harder as you get bigger and you have people in different parts of the country. But you can create and maintain those connections and that closeness through technology, as long as you're quite thoughtful about how to do it. You can do it badly and you can do it well, I think.
Yes, as it's true with most things. And you spoke about your legacy and your sense of achievement, and you've talked about your experience of being there almost at the beginning, employee number one, and through the different stages of evolution until you left and the company was sold when you had 130, 140 people. When you look back, what are you most proud of, your achievements during that period?
I'm proud of the work that we did. And we did, I think, we came up with some really interesting and innovative and clever ideas on a number of really important projects. So we did great work. We built some great relationships. We made some great friends. But I think probably the thing I'm most proud of is the team and, seeing people. So I've seen quite a lot of people over the last kind of 12 years, seeing people grow and get really, really good at things. And, a number of them have moved on and are doing amazing things in all sorts of different areas. And seeing people grow in, one of the phrases I always use is confidence and competence. And I think those two go hand in hand, and seeing people both become more skilled and more knowledgeable and become confident and enjoy it, and then spread that sense of enjoyment and empowerment and excellence and skill, I think is really lovely to see. It's the people that is the thing I feel most proud of looking back, and what those other people have done and who they are.
Yeah, what they've done and who they are. Yeah, lovely. And so finally, what advice would you give to somebody embarking on the path of building a coaching culture? Are there any key tips that you would share with our listeners?
The tips that I would share would be, it's a good idea of creating a coaching culture is brilliant. And, I think the combination of almost like coaching plus culture is really powerful. But do think about why you're doing it, and don't just do coaching for the sake of doing coaching. I think for us, the thing that really clicked was coaching was an amazingly effective way of helping people do the kind of work that we were doing. And I think you need to know why you're doing it and what your wider goals are. So do it with an end in mind. And the third thing, I think, is keep it living and, constantly changing, because I think certainly one of the things I've learned is that you need to be constantly looking at how things are working in practice. So it's all those points around, thinking about the detail, defining the processes, making sure they're consistent, making sure that, you know how the whole of the organisation is supposed to work, and that you change things when they need to be changed. So it's almost like being eternally vigilant. You can't just sort of define things or describe a coaching culture and then expect it to happen. You need to build that into the way that you manage things. So build it into your data, talk about it, keep changing it, find out how other people are really experiencing it. And, it's an endlessly fascinating work in progress, I think, rather than a one-off.
Yes, an endlessly fascinating work in progress is a great description, and that feels like a perfect place to finish our conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Such an interesting description of the journey that you went on individually for yourself and also through Farsight. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today. It's been such a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. It's been really nice to stop and reflect back and really helpful. And also thank you, Rosie, for all the support that you provided to us along the way, because you were a really key part of this. It's been great, so thank you.
Well, that's a pleasure on both counts. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.